Hi, I'm Neil Nobel, editor-at-large of The Prickly Pear. That's thepricklypear.org. One word, thepricklypear.org. Be sure to save us on your browser. Welcome to the Cactus Patch. Our guest today is Jeffrey Utsch. Jeffrey is a founding member of the Heirs of the Republic, which is a grassroots nonprofit 501c3, has become a recognized constitutional scholar and historian with an interest in the founding of our country. Jeff previously served as director and ambassador for the Navy SEAL Foundation, has for 20 years trained U.S. military personnel, mostly in the special forces community in swimming, and he's the president of a small company in Tucson, Arizona. You are a Renaissance man, Jeffrey.
Don't know a lot about that, but love life and love working with people. I think mostly I'm just a teacher.
Well, how did you get involved with the Heirs of the Republic? I understand you also teach at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I teach at the Leadership and Freedom Center in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and I actually give some battlefield tours and leadership lessons. My mom was born and raised in Gettysburg, and so I get to. I was originally from Chesterfield County or Richmond, Virginia. So growing up, we'd spend part of our summers up in Gettysburg running Pickett's Charge and going about the battlefield. So I think because of my love of history, and that really started my love of history, Neil, by the way, is going up to Gettysburg. And I had Yankee cousins up there, and I was from the South. In the early 70s, we didn't play cowboys and Indians like everybody did out here. We played rebels against the Yankees. And even as a young man, I was trying to figure out, okay, I'm being taught this down in Richmond, and I hear new things up in Gettysburg. What's the truth? So I spent a lifetime, and I have spent a lifetime in trying to figure out what the causes of the Civil War were, what are the lessons that we can take from that and apply to today. And working out at Gettysburg, I mean, there's just so many things to learn there. It's just a wonderful place to be. But I live in Tucson, travel back there regularly.
Well, you've got a fascinating background. And tell me about your work with the SEALs and the Special Forces community.
Yeah, I just do a small part. I came out from Virginia to go to the University of Arizona on a swimming scholarship and trained for many, many years, not just my years as a student. For various Olympic trials. And anyway, I got into open water marathon swimming and then started teaching triathletes around the country and eventually started teaching the SEAL teams certain basic things. And then they had me develop some courses for them. So I've been doing that for about 25 years. That ages me, yes, but getting in the water is a good thing to try to keep our health up. And so I just do a very small part some of the guys training and really enjoy it. I'm not a SEAL and never have been, haven't been in the military, but just rubbing shoulders and getting to affiliate with guys of that caliber, willing to put their lives on the line for us, really humbles me. And I get to peek under the sheets, so to speak, and on a regular basis. And people out there still believe that our nation is worth sacrificing and even dying for to preserve our liberties, our way of life, and the opportunities we have. So anytime that I might get down or a little depressed or think, hey, we just don't, where's this generation that's going to step up? We have people that are willing to.
Well, you've sort of blended history, constitutional expertise, and an affiliation with the military and first responders in a kind of unique way. I understand you've got a new program that's directed towards law enforcement. And there's been a lot of controversy about law enforcement, obviously, over the last year or so, and debates about whether or not we need civilian review boards and whether the police are acting in too militaristic a way. Give me your reflections on that and tell me what you're doing. It's a rather unique program as I understand it.
Sure. Well, I've been teaching this probably for 5 years now or more to local law enforcement. So, either sheriff's departments or local police departments. And I actually have a grant. So if this reaches anyone that would like to have me come out and teach, I have Policing with a Purpose. and really started to develop this because the police haven't just been under attack recently. I mean, it has recently escalated, but they really have been under attack. Even under the Obama administration, we saw some narratives coming out of hands up, don't shoot, and police brutality. And you know, I read Heather McDonald's book, The War
Yes.
on Cops, which I believe you've read as well. It's really
Excellent book.
important to get the facts straight. You know, and one of the creeds that we have in my nonprofit, Heirs of the Republic, which is really dedicated to securing the blessings of liberty. The other tagline is freedom is not a spectator sport. You know, that we all need to get involved. This is not something we're watching from the sidelines. But the other creed or motto or principle we try to live by is Davy Crockett's creed. You know, if you read his biography, his autobiography, which is to this day, I think one of the greatest autobiographies ever written, is he says, make sure always you are correct, then go ahead. So if we're going to opine our past judgment on law enforcement, local law enforcement, let's make sure we have our facts right. Let's make sure that we do as Heather McDonald did. You know, let's get into the numbers if we're saying that, you know, most cops are racist or have an agenda to keep down the black population or something along those lines. Let's know what we're doing. And so back in that era, I decided, look, let's really do some research on how local policing started. And we see and hear just in the last few months that there's been some false narratives going around that the local policing started to round up runaway slaves and these kind of things. And if we're not educated on this, you know, how do we know if they're telling the truth? Oh yeah, local law enforcement was enforcement of slavery. I mean, that's the biggest bunch of hogwash. Now, did they have those runaway slave patrols? Certainly they did. But to try to attack local policing in that way, it reminds me a little bit of the 1619 Project. Instead of focusing on the fundamentals in the American creed that the American people became, you know, from what was the colonial mindset, even in the 1760s, to transfer to the American mindset of 1775 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776, is totally different. I mean, we were not founded as a slave nation. We were founded on principles and ideals that were revolutionary in the world. And so I decided to go back and let's research, you know, local policing in the United States. Let's try to support these local law enforcement officers. And, you know, through my study and reading, I knew James Adams taught that John Otis was really the father of the American Revolution. And John Adams was in the middle of it all up there in Boston. So he saw what his relative Sam Adams was doing in the Boston Tea Party. He saw it all. But he said, really, the original spark that really gathered people together was a matter of policing. And we've all heard of, you know, the big reason was no taxation without representation. Well, that's of course true. But even before that, Neil, what happened is James Otis filed a lawsuit against the mother country because the redcoats were in Boston. Basically, they had writs of assistance. And writs of assistance were basically a general search warrant that the redcoats obtained to make general searches in areas in blocks without any specific search warrant. So they could search anybody's house within a given block and look for anything they wanted. So it was, you know, just going in and trying to create mayhem. And James Otis said, look, you can't do this. We are also Englishmen, even though we're colonists, and we deserve to be treated as Englishmen and have certain rights. And so we don't want a foreign power or a centralized power from London sending over their agents of the law, the redcoats, that are controlled by that central power, enforcing the law locally. We are big boys and girls. We can police ourselves. We want to police ourselves. If there's something going on and Johnny's doing something wrong next door, we can get a search warrant and we can take care of it. So this is really critical to understand because policing in America is done differently than any other nation on earth. And the way it was set up and is still supposed to be set up is under the principle of federalism, that we want to divide power, that we don't want a federal or national authority policing us locally. And you can go back to the county sheriffs, and in England, of course, the sheriffs were vassals of the state. They were appointed by the king. But in this country, they're elected by the people of the county. And they are supposed to look out for their constitutional liberties. The local sheriff is. And a police department with the police chief is also supposed to be looking out for our constitutional rights. Now, although a police chief is not necessarily or usually elected by the people, he is appointed by a board of supervisors or, a city council that is elected by the people or a mayor. And so we do have these checks and balances. We go back and see all these movies. I think even Die Hard, you had the cops showing up here and there like, no, I'm in charge. I'm in charge. So you have these, conflicts from the national and federal police. But when teaching, Neil, these police officers that they really are the keystone of our republic, that the entire Revolutionary War, John Adams said John Otis was the father of the revolution. And the biggest thing on his list of grievances, it started with local policing. We do not want to federalize police. We can handle it ourselves. And I think that's so critical that's the way the system was set up. And when teaching this, it is new to most of the officers that I talked to.
We were talking about the police issues of today, but I'm old enough to remember the riots of the 1960s, the Watts riots and subsequent riots. And there was a slogan at the time, support your local police and keep them independent. And there was a move at that time for what was called civilian review boards. And these civilian review boards often would simply be political activists that were supportive of a particular mayor who would then sit and micro criticize police officers and that, they weren't on the scene. They didn't have to make split second decisions about life and death and could criticize from the sidelines. In our system, as I understand what you're saying, we've dispersed this power, and there is a civilian review board. It's the election, the voter.
The election, sure,
can do this, and we're seeing this right now, sort of with the division between Buckhead and Atlanta, Georgia.
Sure.
Where they're trying to basically secede to get better policing. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see that in Chicago. So you, of course, are teaching this federal system, but what are you specifically teaching to police officers that is unique in your regard?
Well, first, the importance of understanding that, again, we separated from the mother country. It started, according to John Adams and James Otis, because of policing powers, and that it's so critical that these police departments do remain independent, that, there's a push to federalize,
yes,
even though it's not overt. I mean, let's be honest, there's a push to federalize and have all things be controlled out of DC. And of course, we know the old statement that a centralized government that's powerful enough to give you everything you want is also powerful enough to take away everything you have. And so our system was set up differently than France, England, Mexico. All those countries have national police forces that have edicts come down from on high, and that we are meant to be a system that's kind of like a submarine that's set up that if one compartment's torpedoed and not doing well, we can close that off and it doesn't affect the rest of the nation. Now, there are also risks inherent in that, but the founders understood that. That's why they wanted federalism. That's why they wanted the states to retain sovereignty on all issues not delegated through the Constitution to the federal government. They wanted to be able to have experiments in federalism with the states. If you wanted to nationalize healthcare or make healthcare right in a specific state, then go ahead, vas-y, as the French would say, and let's see how that works out. If you want to allow abortion in one state, then do that. But there's no power to mandate that throughout. If you want to allow, as horrible as this is, I think, men and women sports in a certain state, then that's up to you, but don't force it to everybody. And so, that those were supposed to be experiments in what works in each state, and then the states were to compete against each other. Now we still see that in many things that are going on right now. With people moving from more of the hardcore tax states into the lower tax states or opportunities, and we do see that competition, but more and more we're kind of becoming homogeneous because the federal government keeps taking more and more power from the states. So I teach them that. We talk about their oath of office, why they take it and what it means. Why do we take an oath to the Constitution? And what's the relationship between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence? Most people think they know that, but they don't really understand it. And James Madison said, who's the father of the Constitution? No Constitution, no United States of America. So the Constitution was formed specifically to protect the ideals in the Declaration of Independence. So Lincoln said, an apple of silver framed by a frame of gold, or maybe it was vice versa. Maybe it was an apple of gold framed by a frame of silver. But the Constitution was the frame and the Declaration was what was being framed. So he made very clear that the Constitution was made for the Declaration, not the other way around. And so if we think about that, when we take an oath of office, it is because we adhere to what used to be widely known as the American Creed, that we do believe that all men are created equal. We believe that. The first nation in the history of the earth, Neil, that espoused that belief. There had been other individuals that espoused that belief, but we're the first ones to say it and believe it. And then you have this new age, well, when Jefferson wrote that, he didn't really mean it. It was only white men. No, he meant it. And we know he meant it because he wrote in his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, that he feared for our nation, knowing that God is no respecter of persons and that all men are created equal in what they were doing with the slaves at the time, that he feared for that. We know that they meant it, but they didn't live up to it yet. That we were the first nation in the world to believe in unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I teach that to secure, and this is the big one, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So we talk to the local police officers. Their main duty is to preserve the liberty of the people that they serve. Now, you may say, well, how does that happen? Because only through law and order can we have liberty. And I give the example of the Vikings coming over to pillage and plunder, the English, back in the day, 1,000 years ago. And individually, we would see that the plunderers would get jealous of the providers. And so it was the biggest or the most powerful would take from those who were providing. And so eventually the English organized themselves into local groups. And this is, groups of 100 and 1,000, and how they eventually came up with the sheriffs and these kind of things, and protected themselves. So the goal is to have the providers to be protected from the plunderers, and without the protectors becoming the plunderers themselves, to understand their proper role. And then I give a little example, Neil, I'm going on a little bit, but I want to get this in, is I give a little example of we're all seeds, all of us people, we could be the littlest mustard seed or a big black walnut seed, but we all are different and we all have different potentials and talents. And the key and role of the police departments is to make sure that the soil that those seeds are planted in remains fertile. And that's our liberty, law and order. Because if you don't keep it fertile and you plant it, then the opportunity for those seeds to grow is going to be minimal. So we know if a seed is planted in the middle of a runway in Phoenix Airport, it doesn't have much of a chance of growing. I don't care how good the seed is. And if you were born in Russia in the 1940s or 50s, your chances of reaching your potential without liberty and opportunity is very minimal. And our founders understood that connection, the direct connection between your liberty and your ability to reach your full potential or your full measure and pursue your own happiness. And so with that law and order, they do that. And then our own efforts, I equate to the rain. So you can still be planted in good soil, but if you don't work it and water it, which is our own efforts, you're still not going to reach your potential.
There seems to be an effort on the part of the left right now to really upend our law enforcement system. They use the term reimagine. Let's reimagine a police force of psychologists. Even the mayoral candidate of New York is talking about disarming the police. Yeah. And we're seeing an attack on the idea of bail, and even an attack on the idea of incarceration and punishment. And this sort of blends two expertises you have, which is this law enforcement philosophy and your knowledge of the Civil War. This seems to me to be almost, people are comparing this to the American Civil War, the way America is dividing into these various camps. But I think it's more similar to the French Revolution, because, you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there would have been a big disagreement between a Southern or a Northern soldier if you'd ask him about the nature of man and whether there should be a police force and whether or not there should be prisons for people who are wrongdoers. It was really more the French Revolution said that, you know, we should go back to a state of nature. And if we do that, everything will be peaceful. So you're getting most of this ferment from the left, and it is really revolutionary and almost French revolutionary, at least in my opinion. Give me your take on this.
Well, yeah, let's talk about this a little bit. I mean, you know, you had Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine both write about the French Revolution. Thomas Paine, of course, was a defender of it.
Yeah.
And was almost killed by it, and had a big schism with George Washington because he thought Washington should have sent people over there to save him. And the only reason Thomas Paine wasn't killed is his jail cell was open when the guy came by to color all the guys that were supposed to be executed, and he missed his door. But Edmund Burke said, look, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are certain things that we've learned through history, certain norms, certain structures, that if you try to change things too quickly, there's a lot of danger in that. And so there are a lot of differences, and I do a course on this, between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And of course, one of them was federalism. You know, all the power came into the National Assembly, and really a group of oligarchs that were running it from the top down, and also more democracy. So, you know, we know, and the founders knew, that a pure democracy didn't work, because, you know, the same a group that killed Socrates one year put a statue up for him the next. You know, these wide swinging emotional decisions going on. And that's, of course, what happened in France. We had no federalism. We didn't have a basic understanding of the norms and how keeping part of that could help keep society together, and the vast swings that could happen in a pure democracy. And of course, many other things that happened there that were incongruent with the American Revolution. Also, the level of education of the leaders and the forethought and foresight. And also, you have to remember, in America, before we became a nation under the Constitution, we had 13 individual sovereign states under the Articles of Confederation that were experimenting in republican and federal forms of government. So when they came together, we're talking about a total of 130 plus years of experience trying to run a republican form of government. The French did not have that. And so, yes, we can learn from them and what happened there and what's going on in these great vacillations. So again, I look at the American system, that even though it's risky, and yes, you can have a rogue local law enforcement, group, a county that's maybe run by a bad sheriff, but it compartmentalizes it. It doesn't mean the whole submarine's going down. We can batten down the hatches. The Titanic's not going down. And this is a big safety net, Neil, for the population of America. And, we've also seen historically that those type of leaders in those counties or police departments eventually will get found out and weeded out. So people get smart with that.
Another thing that concerns me, and Tucker Carlson was talking about this last night, is the attempt on the part of this administration, the statement by the Attorney General Garland yesterday, who says the biggest threat to the republic is white supremacy, which is never really defined and seems to be being defined as anyone who opposes the Biden agenda is a terrorist and should be prosecuted by law enforcement. What do you make of this development?
Well, what I make of it is we have very ignorant people leading us right now that do not follow the Davy Crockett creed of making sure they're correct. Because so far out of the Biden administration, I've heard Biden say that his military or joint chiefs of staff have told him the greatest threat is climate change. And then all of a sudden we hear about white supremacy is the greatest. If they were students of history, they would understand what is the greatest threat to our nation. And I teach a class on this because throughout our history, we've had the greatest questions of our era. And for instance, at the founding, it was, are we going to separate from the mother country? Okay. And then it was, what are the principles we're going to be guided by? Actually, before that, then are we going to separate? And then it's, how are we going to govern ourselves? And then the greatest question of the era was, well, how are we going to interact with foreign powers? And so you go through this. And even I think 5-10 years ago, it would be the greatest question of our era would have been, what is the proper role of government? We have this big fight about, is it to make things equal? Is it equity? Is it, to make sure everybody's safe? Well, we forget that in the Declaration of Independence, governments are instituted among men to protect these rights, unalienable rights. We already knew the answer to that, and we're trying to discover it. It's one of the reasons I was so frustrated with COVID, because we have all these governors out there saying, my primary duty is to keep you safe. Well, have you ever read the Declaration of Independence? Did Patrick Henry say, give me liberty? Oh, no, never mind. I would rather have safety. No, he said, give me liberty or give me death. Now, if we had one governor, and I haven't heard any of them say it, and we have some better than the others, that would have said, look, preserving your liberty is my first priority. And but there's certain times when our priority of principles need to change temporarily. And temporarily, your safety, until we find out what's going on, is going to take priority right now. And there are times, we have laws where, Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. We have times when you have to declare martial law, but those aren't to become the norm or the rule. They are exceptions to the rule, So if we would have had one governor come up and say that we're going to do this for a certain number of weeks or months, and if it extends further than that, I'm going to call a special session of the legislature to make sure you're represented in making sure that I have the legitimate power from the people to keep up these edicts from the executive branch. But did anybody do that? What a great opportunity we've had in Arizona. We could have had for our governor to do that and for our legislative branch, Neil, to step up and try to rein in those powers. Instead, throughout the nation, we have had precedent upon precedent that a governor, without question, has this authority to say if there's an existential threat, according to him or her, they have the power to do these things without us being represented by the legislature. So if all of a sudden climate change and you're driving a big 8-cylinder Suburban and they decide that the world's going to end in 10 or 11 years and you're an existential threat, they can take your car, or if you're seen driving it on the freeway, you will be fined. Just like they shut down unilateral decisions by the executives, who can stay in business and who cannot.
I
So
agree with
these
you.
things get me fired up.
I think the postmortem on this whole thing is much like a declaration of war. It should come from the legislature, except for a temporary period of time where maybe the executive needs to act swiftly. You can't really deny basic liberties the way we did without getting at least consultation from the representatives of the people. It really is scary the way this developed, and it's a bad precedent.
Well, so I went off on a long tangent to answer the question. So the greatest question of our era, and you mentioned, what is the biggest threat? No, the biggest threat to our nation is internal division because of a lack of common vision. Now, the first motto for the United States was E pluribus unum, out of many one. And people go, well, I thought there was strength and diversity, Jeff. How can these be congruent? Well, here's the way they are congruent. Both are true, but we don't explain both. E pluribus unum means out of many one in vision, that we adopt the American creed, that we do believe all men are created equal, that we do believe in unalienable rights for the individuals and treated as individuals, that we do believe that government's primary role is to protect our liberties, and we do believe that the powers given to government come from the people. That's all in the Declaration. So at our founding, there were disputes between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists of, how do we maintain these liberties? One group wanted a little more power in the federal government, the other group wanted more in the states, but they both had the same vision. And so they were able to compromise and get us there. And we've seen in different parts of our national history that as long as we've shared the same vision, we've been able to come together and compromise on how to get there. The Civil War happened because we lost our common vision. We had one section that believed that the extension of slavery was okay. And we had another one that said, no, it's not. And, the founders had the vision of, no, it's not. Even before the Constitution was ratified, the Northwest Ordinance, right, they didn't want any slaves there. And almost every man that signed the Declaration of Independence understood that slavery was an evil. We had it, but it was something to try to get rid of. By the 1860, that wasn't the case. History had started to be rewritten as early as 1826, that the founders really didn't mean that all men were created equal, and that slavery was a positive good for us and the slaves. So right now, the greatest threat to our nation and the greatest question we have is, can we find a common vision? That is the greatest threat to our nation right now. Because if I start off in Tucson, where I am, and want to go to DC, if me and the wife have different ways of wanting to get there, we're still going to end up in DC, and we can figure out a way to compromise. But right now, we've had one group that wants to go to Maine and one group that wants to go to Florida. And if we can't try to recapture that vision, but there can be no compromise, because I'm certainly not compromising on flushing the Declaration and the creed, the American creed, down the toilet. And that's exactly what the left is trying to do, because they don't believe in those tenets anymore. Now, they'll say they do, but they really don't.
Right.
You can't have equality and equity in the same sentence.
I'm sure we could
define it.
We could go on a bit longer, but I feel in the interest of time, are you still giving your podcast for iHeartRadio?
We've taken a hiatus, but there's almost 100 podcasts under Constitutional Conversations on iHeartRadio. But I'm still publishing quite a few articles, and people can find my articles on jefutsch.com. So www.jefutsch, last name is UTSCH.com. And they can also reach me at jeff@freedomexpoaz.com. Jeff@freedomexpoaz.com, because my group puts on an annual expo. And we think, as Jefferson thought, a nation that's ignorant is free, and free is never something that was or ever can be. And so we're all about education.
Well, Jeffrey, thanks so much for your time and joining us in the Cactus Patch. And we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Neil, thanks for your time, sir.